Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Today we have a discontinued gem review, and this is a long time coming because this is probably one of my favorite niche leather fragrances of all time, okay? And you guys know leather is one of my favorite categories of all time. And this is specifically a leather chypre, which is kind of one of my favorite subcategories of leather of all time. So I've been sitting on this for many years, and this sort of wraps up, I would say, a trio of fragrances that are inspired after the great Bel Ami. Now, after this review today, I will have reviewed all three of those fragrances, and finally, one of these days, I will build up the intestinal fortitude to review the great Bel Ami. I just always feel like, man, those Vintage Hall of Fame reviews, I feel like I really have to hit it on the head, because I feel like the fragrance has deserved that type of review. And it's a little intimidating, doing a review of one of the all-time great fragrances. But today we're going to talk about a fragrance I would say is heavily inspired by the great Bel Ami, and it is Puredistance M. So let me show you how it sort of comes in the packaging. This fragrance is unfortunately discontinued. They have released a version 2.0, which I hear is a pale imitation. I haven't smelled it, but I hear it's a pale imitation of the original from 2010. The nose behind the fragrance is Roja Dove. So it comes in a box like this, very nice box. It sort of opens up like this and like this, and the fragrance sits right here in this little coffin with the silk and all that stuff, and the padding and all that. Now it also comes with some books, which we'll discuss, and if you want an image of the fragrance, this is the perfect image right here. The James Bond level man in the tuxedo with the James Bond Aston Martin in the background. I'll read you the blurb at the end. But the words used by Puredistance are noble, sophisticated, and sensually exciting. So that's how they describe it. The packaging is kind of cool, but it comes with this thing. You're supposed to like tie it in or something. And honestly, I just usually stick it in there like this and just shut it because I have no idea how it's supposed to be tied. It also comes with this little authenticity thing from the founder of Puredistance. And so it all ends up sitting in here like so. So I just kind of stick everything in there, and then you close up the box, and that's how it's easy to bring. I brought it with me on my trip to Houston a couple days ago, and I've actually been wearing it as my scent of the day for 3 days straight, and did not get bored of it one second. I love wearing these type of fragrances. And actually, I'm going to reapply. Maybe I'll do a fresh application. I applied about 4 or 5 hours ago. So sure, let's reapply. Screw it. People keep telling me I need to spray more on these reviews. So okay, here. So we'll do some reapplications. So look at that. Oh, it's beautiful too. So in the niche world, there's a trio, kind of a trinity of fragrances that I would say are inspired by the great Bel Ami, and this will be the final review of those three. Okay, so one of the greatest woody leather fragrances of all time is Bel Ami, and this is exactly that. Okay, so this is one of the early Roja creations. Early Roja and Roja currently are two almost completely different brands as far as the way that the ideas and the way that the fragrance line is going, and who they're marketing to and their target audience and all that stuff. So this is one of the early Roja creations. In 2010, he worked with Puredistance on creating this. In 2012, he worked on Fetish pour Homme. He released it for his own house. I've got a comparison video on the channel between the discontinued paper label of the Eau de Parfum of Fetish, which kind of look like this, and the modern Pure Parfum, which is now also discontinued by Roja, very stupidly and sadly, I think. But if you're interested in learning about Roja's sort of initial breaking into what I would say the niche world when his brand was first launched over a decade ago, and well, maybe coming up on 15 years even now. I think some of the earliest Rojas were like 2009, 2010, if I'm not mistaken. But now, actually, Roja Dove and the brand announced that there's a new younger perfumer that's going to be doing work on this new Roja collection. So I'm not even going to get into the optics of is Roja the perfumer? Is he not a perfumer? I'm not going to get into that debate at all. But I will say that if you go to my channel, click on playlist, there's a Roja / Pierre de Valet, which is Roja's sister brand, which I'll be talking about. Got some samples. I'm waiting to talk about those here in a little bit as I get to know them more. But if you go to that playlist, you'll see there's 39 videos on that playlist. of Roja fragrances. I've done a ton of work on the House of Roja on the channel. And if you check many of those old Roja videos out, you will notice that many of his fragrances are compared to fragrances of yesteryear, okay? So for example, Scandal Pour Homme, this is a vintage paper label bottle of the Eau de Parfum, which this version's discontinued. You could still buy Scandal in the Parfum Cologne or the Pure Parfum, but it's going to reference these very strong citrus-heavy Chypres of the past. So if you think of things like Chanel Pour Monsieur, this is a version, vintage version called Gentleman's Cologne. This is how it came originally, or sometimes it'll be called Chanel for Men. Excuse me, depending on the market. Or, for example, YSL Pour Homme, which this is a vintage bottle from the 70s. I absolutely love this stuff. This is probably one of my favorite versions, or one of my favorite fragrances of this category, this sort of citrus, you know, Chypre. Although this brings in some fougere elements in the top because there's lavender and some other things with that Chypre base though. And of course, the much loved Eau Sauvage by Dior. So Scandal brings in elements of all of those three. And then we have Diaghilev, which again, I've reviewed all of these on the channel if you want to check it out, but Diaghilev is going to bring in elements of things like Mitsuko, things like Rochas Femme, with the leather touches of what I would say would be something like Hermes or Germain Cellier's Bandit from Robert Piguet. You know, if you know those sort of old school, Hermes is from the 60s and Bandit is from the 40s. So, you know, Roja's sort of knowledge goes way back. He incorporates a lot of elements of vintage fragrances from many, many decades ago. And maybe the most blatant inspiration from his creations, I would say, hugely similar, is a fragrance he released called Danger. And Danger is inspired by fragrance heavily by Guerlain's Heritage, which is a top 10 fragrance for me. I would say one of the greatest of all time. A signature, easily could be a signature scent for me. I love Heritage. You can go check out my Danger review. I touch on the subject there, and even go so far as to things like his Vetiver fragrance, you know, is going to give you shades of Guerlain's Vetiver. He loves using Guerlain as sort of a reference point, I would say, and then riffing off of it or creating things from there, okay? Or vintage fragrances from the past or Guerlain. Even Danger for Women, which I don't have, is sort of a take on Samsara, another Guerlain. Some say he ran off with Guerlain's cookbook because he used to work for them for a little bit. But his sort of modus operandi early on was that he would take these vintage fragrances and he would, what I ended up coining the term, he would Roja them up, okay? So he is very well known to take something and Roja it up. So in Fetish, which is based loosely on Bel Ami, or not so loosely depending on your point of view, he sort of takes that Bel Ami character and adds some things like fig, which adds this sort of like marmalade-like oriental feeling to it. Like imagine spreading marmalade on like a cedar woody type log with that Bel Ami leathery sort of oak moss undertone. And then, of course, with a lot of smoke. So they've amped up this churchy type incense in here. And so this, a fragrance called Salage, which is a Kajal fragrance, which I reviewed on the channel within the last couple months. And finally, Puredistance M, which we're going to be talking about today, make up what I would say is like the holy trinity of niche fragrances that are inspired by the great Bel Ami. Those three, and I would love a bottle of Salage one day. I really, really enjoyed it. You know, it brought in elements of Bel Ami, which I absolutely loved. You can go check out my review there. So now you know the backstory. I wanted to go through that because the backstory is very, very important to sort of understanding, I would say, Puredistance M. So what does it smell like? What makes it so special? So the very first thing is that this is a huge, profound leather chypre. It opens up very woody, smoky, not as smoky as Fetish, okay? That was one of the things I think that was kind of Roja'd up. I think he sort of made multiple versions, if you will, and rumor had it that this actually got discontinued first. So this was discontinued for like a year or two before his Fetish was discontinued, and rumor is Roja was the oil supplier of note to Puredistance. He ended up cutting them off first, keeping Fetish on the market a little bit longer, and then eventually he either had to discontinue it because, I don't know if the oil supply just couldn't keep up, I don't know if something was discontinued by one of the big oil houses, or I just don't know if it wasn't selling and he just decided, screw it, we're going to go in a different direction, which is very often the case when a fragrance gets discontinued. And so it's not as smoky as Fetish pour Homme, which was released a couple years after Puredistance M. And of course, the part that you're going to notice right from the beginning is the leather. All right, the leather is there right from the start. When you first spray on, like I just did 10 minutes ago or whatever it was, there's no question about it, okay, that the fragrance is second to none as far as a leather note. As soon as the juice touches your skin, it offers this unbelievable amount of class, of depth, and this like sexualized mojo, you know? It says, I'm sexy, I'm classy, and stirred with just the right amount of danger. That's kind of the feeling of the fragrance. It's almost like you just can't resist it. At least for me, this is like my kind of fragrance through and through. This fragrance speaks to me as a leather lover. You know, it says if we're at the bar, you can just make eye contact with somebody without even speaking and know exactly what the other person is thinking. And I've heard some folks promulgate there is this funky bit in here that gives off this sexualized warmth, and their hypotheses is that there's oud in here. I've heard multiple people say there's this oud-like accord. I'm not sold on the idea that there's oud in Puredistance M. My guess would be that there's probably more castoreum, and that there's maybe like an unlisted castoreum note that's used, and castoreum gives this unbelievable animalic leathery bit that can be slightly metallic, but very, very warming and funky, you know, and adds that leathery funk to it. But either way, there's definitely this feeling of like two bodies pressed up against each other. But instead of in fragrances, maybe like Shalimar or something like that, where the bodies are sort of brought together by this ambery oriental touches, or something like Diaghilev, where there's this feeling of, you know, two bodies making love in a stuffy room sort of thing. The ambery touches kind of make up that feeling of the two bodies pressed against each other in fragrances like Diaghilev and Shalimar. Whereas you can feel the resinous tone, I would say, of Cistus labdanum and stuff like that in the creation of that leather accord of Puredistance M. But if you can just imagine the two bodies pressed against each other are not naked, but they're each wearing like this very high-end leather jacket. I don't know what a high-end leather jacket would go for nowadays, 1,000, 3,000. Imagine like a very high-end leather jacket. You can smell like the anticipation of maybe what's to come, but even though you are right next to the other person, you're smelling that leather. You get this rich and luxurious and rare leather. Imagine like Corinthian leather from the old like automobile advertisements from back in the day, the old car adverts. Nothing as crude as like a dominatrix leather suit like you may see in like a Francesca Bianchi fragrance ad, which I have reviewed many of those fragrances. You can go check those out on the channel as well. But remember, this is James Bond level suave, okay? This is not crude. It's not in your face. This sort of leaves things for the imagination, okay? It's not this overtly sexualized sort of marketing or image. And, you know, when you watch a James Bond movie, they leave a lot to the imagination, obviously. But a lot of it is pretty much, it is, what's the word that I'm looking for? It's sort of implied, okay? It's implied. James Bond in his badass tuxedo with the awesome car, you know, there's always the girl around him. Very implied. But that's kind of the way that the feeling of the fragrance is here. This is a very classy fragrance with a very dirty undertone, okay? Now, the most important thing in Puredistance M to my nose is the transition, the very first transition, okay? And that happens probably within the first 20 to 30 minutes, okay? So in that time, the fragrance sort of gives you everything I described, but opening, when it first hits your skin, like when I first sprayed, and I can still get it now 15 minutes in or so, but there's this almost like what I would call very dense, sort of citrusy, fleshy bergamot that comes to the top. And most times I discuss the citrus notes in these very heavy sort of winter type fragrances, and this made my top 20 winter list, is why I was obsessed with kind of wearing it and doing a full review. But it's like trying to take a picture of the Flash as he sort of runs by. You know, the bergamot many times, or lemon, or these sort of notes in the top of these very heavy leather fragrances often just get drowned out from the very beginning. Not in Puredistance M, okay? Puredistance M here, the bergamot is sort of dosed in a fashion where I would say it's used in a very heavy-handed way, okay? But what that heavy-handed use of bergamot does is that in the first 20 to 30 minutes or so of the fragrance, as it unfurls on your skin, you get this sort of like landing pad, you know, for this very sensual leather to emerge. Almost as if you are, almost as if you're having a conversation with a person that like really intrigues you and something caught your attention, but the more the person talks, the more you're enthralled with the person. This fragrance is just allowed to open up. The bergamot is big, metallic, fresh, bright, citrusy, but it's dosed in such a high way that it almost makes it feel thick. You know, there's like a thickness to the citrusy. Even though it's a volatile citrus note that flies off your skin very quickly, it's a high dose of bergamot and lemon, okay? And those two things kind of intertwine in the beginning to give the fragrance a little bit more, what almost feels like headspace or like breathing space, you know? Space to breathe. And then it brings in, you know, this very tart, bitter, you know, touch before the heavier oriental touches and leather truly just take over the scent, truly envelop it, right? It's not like it just comes and it's gone in a flash, right? It's there, it's on your skin, and you can appreciate it for a little while before the heavier elements just envelop it, okay? So think of my description just now as sort of the top of the fragrance, okay? That's the top. And that big Baroque leather Chypre that I was discussing earlier is the base, okay? So what's in the middle is sort of two things, and one is spices, and the other is this floral note, and it's the heart of the fragrance that acts as like the highway of the scent, if you will. So there's sort of this funneling the top and base notes back and forth in a way that seems so interconnected in this fragrance. It's absolutely beautiful. And that funneling, it's like, imagine the Aston Martin from the picture I showed you earlier, right? This is like the picture of this fragrance. They nailed it. Usually the adverts are bullshit, but here, I think they absolutely nailed it. I mean, just look at that. That is a perfect representation. Imagine that car on this highway that I'm trying to describe to you. And imagine the car just doing 130 in the fast lane, excuse me, of said highway. But instead of like the passenger screaming in fear for his or her life, it feels like the car is just absolutely flying in the air, you know, with no turbulence, as the driver is like in complete control, okay? And the car feels like it could easily add another 20, 30, 40 miles an hour without breaking a sweat. You know, it just has, the engine has that feel to it. The car has that smoothness. The road is built, you know, in maybe like perfect Autobahn fashion or whatever you want to call it. But there's that danger element. There's that element of speed, you know? Yes, you're in a classy car. You're in maybe one of the highest end classy cars you could think of. But there's still that element of speed and danger in the world whizzing by. And that's that dirty undertone that you get, okay? So now, most folks are going to overlook some of these heart notes, okay? Because they're focusing so much. This is a very bass heavy fragrance, okay? But in the heart, there are basically two floral notes that make up the heart and add to the, you know, that aura of sensuality, of elegance. One is jasmine and the other is rose. And the one that I get the most is the rose. I get mostly rose from this, not jasmine, but it's a very deep, sensual feeling rose. You know, it blends beautifully with the top and the bottom. It's right in that highway of funneling the notes back and forth to your nose. But the heart notes, the heart note that appears, I would say, the soonest, as soon as that sort of zesty, thick, pillowy bergamot recedes, okay, the first thing that sort of fills that gap, you know, is spices. And the spices here feel like they're turned up with a hint of cumin, actually a pretty heavy dose of cumin, along with this, there's this light throwback thing to like Eau de Hermes. If you've ever heard me discuss the cuminy, leathery combination in Eau de Hermes, but Eau de Hermes is much brighter. Just focus on the spicy aspect of Eau de Hermes with that tiny bit of cumin, you know, that dirty cumin that you kind of appears and then disappears in Diaghilev. Either way, this is where Roja really shines to me. This is where he really brings something to the table that I think is very important. And that's sort of his understanding of the past and how to implement them into a modern fragrance. As I said, leaving the conversation of is he or is he not a perfumer at the door. This attribute of like being able to incorporate vintage style elements from, you know, these amazing fragrances of the past, and do them in a way where a modern format, in a modern niche format, can be sold to the public and loved so much. That's where I really think his um, strengths lie, and that's why I'm very cold on the future of the House of Roja Dove, because they've gone away from that. They've really tried to start incorporating all of these new elements to try and be try and captivate a younger audience, okay? And by doing so, they're moving away from what made Roja Dove. They're going back to that. If you go watch my reviews of the new Amouage Essences line, which I hated, and I said that all of these niche houses now, it's almost like in Idiocracy the movie, where it's like Carl's Jr., Costco, the United States Postal Service, all these like companies merging together, right? Into one name. It just feels like it could be Roja Dove, MFK, Amouage, Initio, Parfums de Marly, just one, and they're all putting out the same crap, all right? But what separated Roja was his ability to understand the past, which most people don't, right? And implement them into implement them into a niche sort of chassis, that can be enjoyed by modern folks without feeling quote unquote vintage or dated and all that stuff, but incorporating some of those vintage elements. I don't love this or Fetish or Kajal Salage as much as I love Bel Ami. Bel Ami is like a top 3, probably top 2. Bel Ami and Chanel Antaeus may switch back and forth depending on how I feel, but that's like 1 and 2 for me, hands down, and that's not going to change. But I do feel right at home wearing something like this. Like, I've loved the last 3 days of wearing this. I wore it to a very important event where I had to speak in front of 500 people and stuff like that, and I enjoyed every second of it, okay? So as the fragrance pivots into the dry down, you get that dirty, animalic, pungent leather, which is just sort of in your face from the beginning, but it really begins to isolate itself more and more into the dry down. The smoky elements are sidelined a bit here. So if you're comparing these two and you're really into smoke, go for Fetish. If you really want the leather to sort of make a front and center announcement, go for Puredistance M. That's really the Cliff Notes version at the simplest level, okay? But that dirty, animalic, pungent leather is just allowed to be isolated and shines. And smoky elements are sidelined, as I said. It just allows the leather to shine with the moss and the patchouli, which is earthy, and the vetiver is earthy as well. There are touches of cinnamon in here with the spices. At first, when the spice kind of fills the space, that the air that was vacated by that bergamot, at first you're going to get a lot of cumin and a lot of dirty spices. Later on into the dry down, you're going to get a lot more what I would say are like warming spices. So the cinnamon is a perfect example of like a warming spice. Yes, it's spicy, but it's more like a blanket around you. Whereas at first you got more of the dirty animalic spices mixed with vanilla, but this is not a sweet vanilla or anything like that. In fact, the vanilla I think just makes up that oriental style base, and a little bit of musk, which I don't get very much of. But what impresses me the most is, let's say the final 8 hours of the fragrance. Let's say it's a 9-10 hour fragrance. The last 8 hours or so into the dry down is just how this sort of like sensual smoothness is played out and incorporated into this rough and tumble elements of the Leather Chypre, okay? So that sensual smoothness is almost a perfect representation of Roja's ability to bring these elements of the past to the future, if I would say, but execute them in a way that's still very luxurious and stylish, and that has the character of some of these fragrances from the past that I love using these modern niche ingredients, okay? Now, when I reviewed Fetish pour Homme, you can go check out my review, as I said something very important, and that is, you can't trust anything I have to say on this topic, because I am a straight up fanboy of this style. I love this style of fragrance. It just short circuits my brain, when I wear it. There's something about it that I just love so much, and I'm probably biased, okay? Because these are the type of fragrances that could easily be signature scents for me personally. And so, as I said, I've been wearing it for 3 days straight. I love every single second of it. I love the woody, spicy, leathery way that it wears. It wears like a fine, high-end perfume with that blast from the past. There also could be a few unlisted notes. So one would be cedar. There's no cedar note listed, surprisingly, but it smells like there is this natural cedar log, you know, mixing with the leather. Imagine this image, like the leather jacket from the two people holding each other under the night sky or whatever I was mentioning earlier, right? Not body to body, but leather jacket to leather jacket. Imagine that leather jacket now comes off and gets hung on the log. And it's hung on that cedar log. And so you're getting old, rustic leather jacket, but very high-end leather jacket with that old cedar log type smell. And apparently the iris and the carnation and those type of notes from Bel Ami here are missing, and that's what makes it maybe a little bit more contemporary. I wouldn't be surprised if Roja snuck in a little bit of iris or something like that to add this suave kind of character, this feeling of something very dapper, you know? As I said, it's just that Bel Ami character Roja'd up, and you can just literally imagine, I mean, you can envision yourself in the cockpit of that Aston Martin, that James Bond Aston Martin. That dry down is perfect representation. It's almost like you can smell the rubber burning when you hit the gas and all of that stuff, right? You can feel each time that the engine shifts, the transmission shifts. You can feel every shift, every pebble on the road. It's beautiful. And the dry down gives off this very dusty, I would say this dryness, you know? Even though the vanilla and resins are supposed to add a little bit of lift and moisture, I love the dry, raw leather with woods and labdanum and resins and the dry down. And it's just leather extraordinaire. One of the best modern niche leather fragrances money can buy, in my opinion. Sad, sad, sad that they discontinued this. Again, there is a version 2.0 that you can buy, but I hear that it's a very pale imitation and from what I've heard. I haven't smelled it. So don't take my word for it. That's just what I hear from the streets. But here, let me read you the little blurb. We'll close with what Puredistance has to say about Puredistance M. So, as I said, noble, sophisticated, and sensually exciting. Puredistance M is sumptuous, sensuous, and complex, but at the same time, noble and sophisticated. Created in London by Roja Dove, M is a leather chypre of classic proportions with an unexpected oriental twist, which lends the perfume an original and modern feel. The warm smoothness of the blend is incomparable. Again, for me, easily could be a signature scent. I love this type of perfumery. Very sad, for whatever reason, this got discontinued. If anyone knows the reason why, do let me know in the comments. But as always, very, very glad to get to knock out this review. This is a long, long time coming. There's so many fragrances like this that are a long time coming to review. It's just a matter of time and getting around to it. If you have experience with Puredistance M or these type of leather chypres, this, you know, Fetish pour Homme, something like Bel Ami, something like Kajal Salage, which again I reviewed on the channel. Let me know what your thoughts are on this style. One of my all-time favorite styles. If I ever had a fragrance brand, you can bet your bottom dollar I would have a hardcore leather chypre like this in there. But this absolutely does the trick for me. So I appreciate everyone watching, commenting, liking, subscribing. It's a pleasure as always to get to do these videos for you guys. Love you. Take care. Cheers. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.